September 2, 1945. Espiritu Santo Island, South Pacific. The war is over. A United States Army soldier stands at the edge of a jungle clearing, and he is not holding a rifle. He is not reading orders, or loading ammunition, or scanning the tree line for movement. He is simply standing still, and staring. Before him, stretching 200 yards in every direction, sits row after row after row of machines. Half-tracks. Iron-bodied, rubber-tracked, battle-worn armored carriers that spent the last 4 years hauling soldiers across the most violent landscapes in human history. Their steel hulls still carry the faded markings of campaigns fought in the dust of North Africa, the mud of France, the volcanic ash of Pacific Islands whose names most Americans had never heard before the war. Some still have ammunition canisters bolted to the hull. Some still carry the scratches of shrapnel that almost ended a young man's life. One has a hand-painted nickname stenciled near the cab in rough white letters, a name some soldier gave his machine, the way men give names to things they trust with their lives. The soldier stares at all of it. Then an officer walks up behind him, holding a clipboard, and says 4 words that will define one of the most extraordinary decisions of the post-war era. We can't ship them. And with those 4 words, America made a choice that no nation on earth had ever faced before, and that no nation on earth, in all of recorded history, could have afforded to make. A choice that stunned military observers across 3 continents. A choice that, when German engineers and Japanese military planners eventually learned of it, confirmed something they had refused to believe even as they were losing the war. America had built so many half-tracks, at such unimaginable speed, at such staggering scale, that it was cheaper to burn them than to bring them home. This is the story of how that happened, and what it meant for every nation that had stood against the most productive industrial civilization the world had ever seen. To understand why the disposal of American half-tracks after the Second World War carries such enormous historical weight, you must first understand what a half-track actually was, and what it meant to the men who rode inside one. The half-track was, at its heart, a compromise. A military engineering compromise between 2 competing demands of modern armored warfare, speed on roads, and mobility across broken terrain. A wheeled truck could move fast on a paved highway, but sank helplessly in the mud of a Belgian autumn or the soft volcanic soil of a Pacific island. A fully tracked tank could conquer almost any terrain, but was slow, expensive, and mechanically complex to build in the numbers that modern warfare demanded. The half-track solved this problem by dividing the vehicle down the middle. 2 conventional rubber tires up front for steering and road speed. 2 continuous rubber over steel tracks in the rear for traction, grip, and the kind of cross-country mobility that kept soldiers alive when the roads disappeared entirely and the map stopped being useful. The concept was not born in America. French engineers had experimented with it through the 1930s. Germany had built its own version, the SD, KFC 251, and deployed it to devastating effect in the Blitzkrieg campaigns that overran Poland in September 1939 and swept through France in 46 days in the spring of 1940. The sight of German panzer grenadiers riding into battle in their half-tracks, standing upright behind machine guns mounted on steel rails, moving in disciplined columns through smoke and fire, had become one of the defining images of modern mechanized warfare. But the American half-track, specifically the vehicle that came to be designated the M3, was something different. Something that German military engineers would study carefully and initially dismiss, before the sheer weight of its production record forced them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about how wars were won. In the spring of 1941, the United States Army Ordnance Department issued production contracts to 3 civilian manufacturers: the White Motor Company of Cleveland, Ohio, the Diamond T Motor Company of Chicago, Illinois, and the Autocar Company of Ardmore, Pennsylvania. None of these companies had ever built an armored fighting vehicle. White made heavy commercial trucks. Diamond T manufactured tractor-trailers for the civilian freight industry. Autocar built industrial haulers for construction and mining. But each of them had something the American military needed far more than specialized military engineering expertise. They had factory floors. They had assembly lines. They had trained workers who already understood how to take raw steel and transform it into a functioning machine in a matter of hours. And they had the one thing that could not be imported, could not be captured, and could not be bombed into submission: they had the organizational knowledge of mass production. The M3 half-track that emerged from these factories was 20 feet and 3 inches long. It weighed just over 17,000 pounds fully loaded. It was powered by a White 160AX 6-cylinder gasoline engine producing 148 horsepower, the same basic engine architecture used in the company's commercial trucks, deliberately chosen so that civilian mechanics could service it without specialized military training. Its maximum speed on a paved road was 45 miles per hour. Its operational range on a single 60-gallon tank of fuel was 200 miles. It could carry a driver and a full 12-man rifle squad. 13 human beings, their weapons, their ammunition, their fear, their hope, across terrain that would have defeated any conventional truck built before the war. Its armor was thin, 6 to 12 millimeters of hardened plate steel along the hull sides and front, enough to deflect rifle fire and artillery shrapnel at range, not enough to stop a heavy machine gun at close quarters. The men who first rode in it gave it a name born of bitterness and dark soldiers' humor. They called it the Purple Heart Box, a reference to the American military decoration awarded to soldiers wounded or killed in combat. The implication required no translation. General Omar Bradley addressed this reputation directly in his field reports, describing the M3 as, in his words, a competent and dependable contrivance, whose bad name resulted from the inexperience of troops who attempted to use it for too many things. General George Patton, characteristically less diplomatic, observed that the half-track was dangerous largely because American soldiers climbed inside one and began to believe they were riding in a tank. They were not. They were riding in a battlefield taxi, a vehicle designed to bring them close to the fight, not to fight for them. But once American crews understood what the M3 was and what it was not, the vehicle proved itself across every theater of the war. It first saw action in the Philippines in December 1941, alongside the Provisional Tank Group attempting to slow the Japanese advance through Luzon. It fought in the deserts of North Africa, where its rubber tracks coped with sand better than anyone had expected. It crossed the beaches of Sicily in the summer of 1943. It rolled through the hedgerow country of Normandy in 1944, and it was still fighting in the Rhine crossings of early 1945 when Germany's last organized defenses were crumbling along the western bank of the river. Through the Lend-Lease program, American M3s reached the Red Army on the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers driving American half-tracks across the frozen steppes of Ukraine and into the shattered streets of cities that had endured 3 years of the most savage urban combat in history. At the Battle of El Getter in Tunisia in March of 1943, M3 gun motor carriages, half-tracks fitted with 75mm field guns, engaged a German armored column and destroyed 30 enemy tanks, including what may have been 2 of the dreaded Tiger IS, before withdrawing under concentrated fire. 21 American half-tracks were lost in that engagement. But the action was noted at the highest levels of both sides' command structures. The machine that German officers had initially dismissed as an underpowered, lightly armored American compromise had just torn apart one of their armored spearheads in the open desert. Even Erwin Rommel himself, Germany's most celebrated armored commander, the Desert Fox whose operational genius had humiliated Allied forces across North Africa, was photographed riding in a captured American M3 half-track during the Battle of Kasserine Pass. One of the finest military minds of the 20th century, choosing to travel in an American machine. The symbolism was unintentional but absolute. While German crews repaired their SD, KFZ, 251s with improvised field fixes, racing against time to keep a shrinking fleet operational, American factories were doing something the German High Command had calculated was impossible. They were producing half-tracks faster than the war could destroy them. In 1942 alone, the first full year of American wartime industrial production, the White Motor Company, Diamond T, and Autocar were rolling M3s off their assembly lines at a rate that left foreign military observers struggling to find language adequate to describe what they were witnessing. Factory workers labored in 3 shifts around the clock. Assembly lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, through summer heat and winter cold and the private griefs of workers who had brothers and husbands fighting in the same vehicles they were building. Women who had never held an industrial wrench 6 months earlier were installing engine mounts and track systems with practiced, professional precision. The American industrial machine, the arsenal of democracy, as President Franklin Roosevelt had named it in his famous fireside chat of December 1940, was operating at a tempo that no Axis power had believed was physically achievable. By 1943, a fourth manufacturer, International Harvester, had been brought into the program producing a closely related variant designated the M5 half-track, intended specifically for Lend-Lease distribution to Allied nations. The production numbers accumulated through 1941, 1942, 1943, 1944, and into the final months of 1945 tell a story that pure statistics struggle to communicate. When the guns fell silent in August of 1945, the United States had manufactured more than 53,000 half-tracks of all variants across the entire family: M3S, M5S, M9S, M13S, M15S, M16S, and dozens of specialized subvariants adapted for anti-aircraft defense, artillery support, medical evacuation, and command operations. 53,000 armored vehicles, each one individually assembled, each one road-tested, each one shipped across oceans and delivered to armies fighting on 5 continents. For comparison, and this comparison is the true measure of what happened, Germany, a nation that had been manufacturing half-tracks since 1935, that had built an entire armored warfare doctrine around their use, that had used its SD, KFZ 251 as the central instrument of the Blitzkrieg operations that had conquered most of Europe in 2 years, Germany produced approximately 15,000 SD, KFZ 251s across the entire duration of the war, less than 1/3 of the American total. And toward the end, German production lines were being disrupted weekly by Allied bombing campaigns that American factories were never subjected to. German engineers scrambled to find steel, rubber, qualified welders, undamaged tooling. American factories had waiting lists of suppliers requesting contracts, 53,000 to 15,000. That ratio is not simply a difference in industrial capacity. It is a difference in ideology. It is what happens when a free market economy of 130 million people, spread across a continent of abundant natural resources, makes a complete national commitment to a single industrial objective. In the winter of 1942, as American half-tracks began appearing in significant numbers on the battlefields of North Africa, German Panzergrenadier officers examined captured M3S with professional interest and some degree of contempt. German military engineering philosophy was rooted in complexity, precision, and craftsmanship. The SD, KFZ 251 was a sophisticated vehicle, proper track and wheel steering for tight turning, angled armor for ballistic deflection, designed as a fighting platform from which troops could engage the enemy while still mounted. It was the product of Germany's finest mechanical traditions. The M3, by contrast, looked to German eyes like something assembled from a commercial parts catalog. Its steering ran entirely through unpowered front wheels, giving it a turning radius that became an exercise in collective frustration on European city streets. Its tracks were molded rubber over steel cable rather than the interlocking metal links of a proper military track, meaning that a single section of damage required replacement of the entire track rather than a simple patch repair. Its armor was flat rather than angled. German officers who examined captured M3S filed reports noting these deficiencies with professional satisfaction. Their conclusion was not without technical merit. In isolation, examining one machine against another, the German engineers were often correct. What they failed to understand, what they catastrophically, fatally failed to account for, was that American industrial philosophy had never been trying to build the finest machine. It had been trying to build the most machines. The difference sounds simple. Its implications were absolute. While Germany debated the engineering specifications of a superior vehicle, America was already delivering its merely adequate vehicle by the tens of thousands. While German factories carefully machined precision components, American factories were deliberately designing components to looser tolerances, manufacturable by workers with 6 weeks of training instead of 6 years. While Germany's production schedules were measured in hundreds per month, America's were measured in thousands. The M3's rubber over steel track, which German engineers dismissed as a compromise, had been specifically chosen because civilian rubber manufacturers could produce it without any specialized military tooling. The commercial truck components in the drivetrain, which German officers found amusingly pedestrian, meant that replacement parts were already stockpiled across the civilian supply network and could be requisitioned without building a separate military logistics chain from scratch. America was not building a masterpiece. America was building a flood. And by the time German commanders in North Africa, then in Sicily, then in France began grasping the full statistical reality of what they were facing, the realization arrived not as a single dramatic moment but as a slow and grinding weight pressing down on every operational calculation they made. Every American half-track destroyed was replaced by 2 more within weeks. Every German half-track destroyed was replaced by silence, by a gap in the line, by infantry soldiers walking where armored soldiers had once ridden. German Panzergrenadier units that had begun the war in full-strength mechanized columns were by 1944 conducting foot marches. Not because they had been defeated in individual engagements, though they had, but because the factories behind the American lines were manufacturing replacements faster than the front line could consume the originals. When Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, the United States found itself in possession of a military-industrial complex of a scale that had no precedent in the entire history of organized conflict. The numbers were staggering in every direction. Nearly 12 million men and women in uniform. Over 300,000 military aircraft produced during the war years. 86,000 tanks. Hundreds of thousands of wheeled vehicles of every description. 9 million tons of supplies staged across Pacific Island bases alone. And 53,000 half-tracks, scattered across Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, the Philippines, the home islands of Japan, and every staging base and supply depot in between. The question was not what these machines had done. The record of their service was written in the liberation of nations. The question, urgent, practical, and unprecedented, was what to do with them now. It was a question America had never had to answer before, because no nation had ever accumulated this magnitude of equipment in this many locations spread across this much of the surface of the earth. And the answer, when it came after weeks of logistical calculation by the War Assets Administration, the federal body created in January 1946 specifically to manage the disposal of surplus military property, was as stark and unromantic as the machines themselves. It was cheaper to burn them than to ship them home. To understand why fire became the instrument of choice over ships, you must understand the mathematics that governed post-war American military logistics in the Pacific. A single Liberty ship, the standard American cargo vessel that had carried war supplies across both oceans throughout the war, cost approximately $2,000 per day to operate. A round-trip voyage from a Pacific Island base to an American mainland port and back took roughly 45 days. 15 for loading and preparation at the forward base, 15 at sea, 15 for unloading and processing at the home port. That represented a minimum operating cost of $90,000 per voyage, before fuel, crew wages, port fees, and insurance were accounted for. The total estimated wartime procurement value of all American surplus property worldwide was close to $60 billion. But post-war demand, the actual prices that buyers would pay on the open market, was a fraction of that figure. The domestic market was flooded with supply. Allied governments had their own mountains of surplus equipment to dispose of and were in no position to buy more. American industry was pivoting back to civilian production with extraordinary speed and had no incentive to repurchase the products of its own wartime contracts at anything approaching their original cost. In this economic reality, a used, battle-worn half-track sitting on a Pacific Island beach was worth less in hard cash than the cost of loading it onto a ship and sailing it somewhere. The arithmetic was merciless and it was unanswerable. If you cannot sell the machine, and you cannot justify the shipping cost, and the machine cannot be economically refurbished for continued military use, then you burn it. Burning costs almost nothing. A drum of diesel fuel and a working lighter. The machine disappears. The logistical line item closes. And somewhere on a Pacific beach, the last physical evidence of 4 years of industrial miracle becomes black smoke rising into a tropical sky. That is what happened. On the island of Espiritu Santo, in what islanders and historians have since called $1 Million Point, enormous quantities of American military equipment, trucks, jeeps, bulldozers, generators, and half-tracks, were driven directly into the harbor shallows because the British and French colonial governments of the New Hebrides had refused to purchase them at the prices America had offered. When the American forces departed, they ensured that nobody else would benefit from what they were leaving behind. The equipment went into the sea. Elsewhere across the Pacific, on islands whose names appeared briefly in wartime headlines and then faded back into geography, fire was the instrument. Half-tracks that had crossed the beaches of Leyte Gulf and climbed the jungle trails of New Guinea were loaded with combustible materials and set alight. The rubber tracks that had gripped volcanic soil and Pacific coral burned with thick, oily black smoke. What remained was twisted steel, steel that could be sold to local scrap dealers by weight, at prices that, while low, at least represented some recovery of value without the cost of transoceanic shipping. General Douglas MacArthur had already established the template in occupied Japan itself, where surrendered Japanese aircraft were ordered to be destroyed immediately upon surrender, gasoline-soaked tarps wrapped around engines and ignited before any rogue pilot could attempt a final mission against occupation forces. The same brutal efficiency that governed the burning of Japanese aircraft was applied, with variations of method and geography, to the mountains of surplus vehicles that now had no economic justification for their continued existence. It was not cruelty. It was not carelessness or arrogance. It was the cold, precise mathematics of a nation so productive that it had genuinely outrun the peacetime economy's capacity to absorb what the war economy had built. Here is the truth that burns beneath this story, deeper than the actual fires that consumed those half-tracks on Pacific beaches. No other nation on Earth in 1945 could have faced this problem. Germany could not have faced it, because Germany had never built enough of anything to have a surplus. In the final months of the war, German Panzergrenadier units were counting individual half-tracks with the same care that a starving man counts bread. Maintenance crews worked through artillery bombardments to keep running what was running. Vehicles that had been technically written off, hulls cracked, engines seized, tracks worn past their rated service limit, were kept in the line because there was nothing to replace them. German Army records from the winter of 1944 and 1945 document entire armored infantry battalions that existed on paper but had fewer than a third of their authorized vehicle complement. Men who should have been riding in half-tracks were walking through snow. Japan could not have faced this problem either. Japanese military production had been strangled by raw material shortages from the opening of the Pacific War. Japan's steel production, its rubber supply, its fuel reserves, all constrained by dependence on imported materials and by the American submarine campaign that by 1944 was sinking Japanese merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced. Japanese soldiers who captured American equipment in the early campaigns of 1941 and 1942 were documented keeping individual components, bolts, wire, tool handles, canvas straps, with a care that revealed everything about the material reality they were fighting within. Nothing could be wasted. Everything was finite. This was the precise opposite of the American experience. And the disposal fires of 1945 and 1946 were its ultimate, irrefutable expression. When German officers learned, as many eventually did, through intelligence reports, through conversations with American counterparts during occupation, through the sheer visible evidence of post-war American logistical operations, that the United States had burned its own machines because there were too many of them, the psychological effect was not dramatic. It was quiet. It was the quiet of a fundamental realization arriving too late to change anything. In post-war testimony from German commanders and staff officers, a pattern emerges across dozens of separate accounts. Different men, different ranks, different theaters, all arriving at some version of the same conclusion. They had been fighting a war of attrition, believing that if they could destroy enough American equipment, American resolve would eventually fracture. They had not understood that American equipment was not a fixed stock to be depleted. It was a river, fed by the largest industrial economy in human history, running at full capacity, drawing from a continent of raw materials and a workforce of unprecedented scale. You could not deplete that river by shooting at what floated past. You could not win by destroying what was already in the field, when the factories behind it were building replacements faster than the field could consume the originals. The burning of the half-tracks was proof. If America had produced so many that burning them was the economically rational choice, then no strategy of attrition had ever had a chance. The United States had not entered the Second World War as a recognized military power. In 1940, the U.S. Army ranked 17th in the world by size, behind Portugal, behind Romania. Its armored forces were equipped with vehicles that European standards considered obsolete. Its operational doctrine was incomplete. In the professional military establishments of Germany and Britain and France, American military capacity was viewed with a combination of condescension and cautious curiosity. The Americans had never fought a modern mechanized war. They had no panzer tradition, no experience of the operational art that Blitzkrieg represented, no armored heritage comparable to the European powers who had been refining their doctrines since 1918. What America had was something that military tradition could not easily categorize or account for. It had factories, enormous, flexible, magnificently productive civilian factories that could be converted to military production faster than any European general staff had anticipated as possible. It had raw materials on a continental scale, undamaged by bombing, undisturbed by invasion. It had a workforce that combined the engineering adaptability of a frontier industrial culture with the organizational precision of mass production methods pioneered in its own automobile industry. And it had a political and economic system that could direct all of this toward a single national objective without the friction of terror, purge, or the enforced compliance of a totalitarian state. American workers built those half-tracks because the contract paid well and because the country they lived in was at war and they understood what that meant. They did not build them under threat of imprisonment. When President Roosevelt stood before the nation in December of 1940 and called America the great arsenal of democracy, he was making a prophecy as much as a policy statement. By the time Japan surrendered in August of 1945, that prophecy had been fulfilled to a degree that exceeded even his stated ambitions. In 1942, Roosevelt had called on American industry to produce 185,000 military aircraft, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 18 million tons of merchant shipping. The actual wartime production numbers surpassed nearly every one of those targets. The M3 HalfTrack was one instrument in that symphony, one voice in a chorus so immense that its very surplus became the final, unanswerable argument of the war. Consider what fire means in this story. In war, fire is the instrument of destruction. It is the burning of cities, the incineration of records, the terminal end of things that cannot be rebuilt. It is what an enemy does to your country when it intends for something to stop existing. But the fire that consumed American half-tracks on the beaches and clearings and airfields of the post-war Pacific was a different kind of fire entirely. It was the fire of surplus. The fire of a nation that had built so much, and so completely, that the question was no longer whether it had enough, but what to do with everything left over. It was the factory floor's fire translated from creation into disposal. The same industrial logic that had commanded build it now, build it faster, build it in larger numbers than your enemy can imagine, now commanded burn it. Because burning was cheaper than shipping. Because even destruction was within the reach of the American budget in a way that preservation was not. The German soldier who had counted bolts in the Ukrainian winter of 1942, and the Japanese infantryman who had salvaged American ration tins from abandoned positions in the jungles of Guadalcanal, and the British logistics officer who had struggled throughout the war to find enough transport vehicles for his operations in the western desert. All of them, when they eventually learned what had happened to American half-tracks at the end of the war, encountered the same irreducible fact. America had not simply won. It had won with so much remaining that it could afford to watch the surplus burn. The fire was not waste. The fire was the truest expression of what the arsenal of democracy had actually meant. Not just the production of weapons, but the production of weapons in such overwhelming abundance that the mathematics of armed conflict had been permanently and irrevocably altered. Not enough to win. Enough to overwhelm. Enough to produce victory and then continue producing past victory, past need, past any conceivable military use, until the only economically honest response to the sheer volume of what had been built was to light a match and let it go. The fires burned out in the weeks and months following the formal surrender ceremonies of 1945. The smoke drifted across ocean water that had witnessed some of the most violent naval combat in recorded history. Twisted steel that remained was collected, sold to scrap dealers by weight, shipped in bulk to foundries, and eventually recast into the automobiles and appliances and structural steel of the post-war American economic boom. The rubber that had once gripped the volcanic soil of Peleliu and the frozen earth of the Ardennes was gone. The hand-painted nicknames on the hull sides were gone. The scratches of shrapnel were gone. Everything that the machines had been through, everything they had carried, everyone they had brought home alive, reduced to black smoke and cooling metal on a Pacific beach. Most of the half-tracks are gone now. A few hundred survive in museums and private collections around the world, maintained by men and women who love these machines with the particular devotion that people reserve for things that outlasted their intended purpose. Their White Motor Company engines have been rebuilt and retuned. Their olive drab paint is fresh. Their machine gun mounts are polished by the attention of curators who understand what they are preserving. You can see them at D-Day anniversaries in Normandy, rolling down the same roads they helped liberate, surrounded by crowds that have never known the world those machines were built to defend. You can read their production histories in Army ordnance records that document, in precise bureaucratic language, the factory shifts and delivery schedules and inspection reports of a production effort that changed the outcome of the century. But the truth of what those machines represented does not live in the survivors. It lives in the absence, in the empty beaches and jungle clearings where the fires burned, in the harbor shallows where the machines went into the water, in the recycled steel of buildings that no longer know what they once were. The truth is in what America chose to do with its surplus, and why that choice was possible, and what it reveals about the nature of the civilization that made it. Some fires announce a beginning. Some fires mark an ending. The fires on those Pacific beaches in the autumn of 1945 were neither. They were the last honest statement of an industrial civilization at the absolute height of its power, a civilization that had built so much, so well, so completely, that even its letting go was a form of magnificence. The war had asked America to produce. America had answered with 53,000 half-tracks, 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and more merchant shipping than the rest of the world combined. And when the question changed, when the world asked what to do with all of it, America answered the only way a nation of that kind could answer. It gave the machines to fire. And in the smoke that rose above those Pacific beaches, curling upward into the blue September sky of a world finally at peace, something was visible to anyone patient enough to read it, the final signature of the arsenal of democracy, written not in ink, but in flame. Not in victory, but in abundance. Not in what had been won, but in what could be released without grief, without desperation, without the hollow fear of a civilization that does not know if it can build again. America knew it could build again. The fires proved it. And the world that rose from those ashes, rebuilt on American steel, organized around American productivity, shaped in its deepest structures by the American capacity to produce beyond every limit that history had previously imagined, that world carried those fires forward, long after the smoke had cleared, long after the beaches were empty, long after the last half-track had given itself back to the earth. The machines are gone. What they built remains.